Now, what are API routes? It's important to understand and keep in mind that some websites which you're building don't just need HTML pages that are being served back to visitors upon requests. That, of course, is something which most websites need, but it's not the only thing that can be needed by a website. You might, for example, have a feature on your website that allows users to submit feedback or sign up for a newsletter. Now, when a user clicks such a button to, for example, sign up for a newsletter, you don't necessarily want to show a different page. I mean, you could show a confirmation page that it was successful, but you could also just show a little info pop up or banner on the existing page. But even if we ignore what we show, let's think about what happens behind the scenes when we sign up for a newsletter. Then we need to send data to some server, to some computer, to then store that entered newsletter email address in some database. And that request which is being sent there is not about fetching a site, it is about storing data. So it's kind of the other direction. We don't want to get a HTML page, instead we want to send that user entered data to some database. And that is what we use APIs for, application programming interfaces. There are different kinds of APIs we could build. REST APIs are the most popular form of APIs, and the idea is always the same, that we have a web server that exposes certain URLs, just as we did it thus far in the course, but those URLs are not about getting requests and sending back HTML data, but they are about accepting some data and then sending back responses with any kind of data, not necessarily HTML. Specifically, JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, would be the most common format for exchanging such data. So API routes are special kind of URLs which you can add to your Next.js application, which are not about getting a standard browser request and sending back a pre-rendered HTML page, but which are instead about getting data, using data, maybe storing data in some database, and sending back data in any form of your choice. So in the end, API routes, this Next.js feature, is a feature that allows us to build a API, a REST API, if you will, as part of our Next.js app. And it would, for example, allow us to support URLs or paths after our domain like this, /API feedback, and then accepting different kinds of HTTP requests, not just GET requests, as all our page routes did thus far, but also POST or PUT or DELETE requests, whatever you need. And then, depending on which HTTP method was used for which path, different actions could be triggered. For example, for a POST request sent to /API/feedback, we might expect some data to be sent along with that incoming request, some feedback data entered by a user, and then when that request hits our API, we extract that data from the request and store it in a database. If a GET request reaches that same URL, we instead might want to fetch data from a database and send that back, but not as a HTML page, but instead as raw data in that JSON format. And those API routes, therefore, don't exist to be entered in the URL typically, but instead to be triggered via JavaScript code, via AJAX requests. So we as a developer add certain code to our page that sends these behind the scenes requests, you could say, to our API to store or fetch data. And that is actually something we already did in this course. When we worked with Firebase, when we sent requests to Firebase, then there we talked to the Firebase API. We send requests to certain URLs for storing data and for getting data. And these URLs, these Firebase URLs, we didn't enter them in the browser. Instead, we sent requests through our JavaScript code, no matter if that code then runs on the client or on the server. We talked to that Firebase API. And now this API routes feature is about letting us define our own API endpoints as part of our Next.js application.